Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November 13, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Peter Rode. We've got the full team here, Tina Stagg, Michael Abdullah and Angelo DeGrazia with me. And we're all from the Space Association, so we're going to get started with some local news. We're going to start off with Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab has announced the manifest for its next Electron launch late this month. The company said the 10th Electron mission, dubbed Running Out of Fingers, will fly 7 small sats. 6 developed by satellite manufacturer and mission management provider Alba Orbital for various customers, and 1 from AIL Co., a Japanese company creating microsatellites that simulate meteor particles. The launch, scheduled for November 25, will be the first block upgrade of the rocket, with changes intended to support eventual reuse of the first stage. And still New Zealand will be home for a methane monitoring satellite program. The Environment Defence Fund, or EDF, will partner with the New Zealand Space Agency on a location for the control centre for MethaneSat mission. The satellite, being developed by the EDF for launch in 2022, will track emissions of methane from oil and gas facilities to monitor the release of the greenhouse gas. The New Zealand Space Agency will spend $16.6 million on the Mission Control Centre and study how data from MethaneSat could also be used to track agricultural sources of methane emissions. And over to you, Angelo.
Okay, let's talk US space policy. A bipartisan group of senators introduced a NASA authorization bill last Wednesday to extend the life of the International Space Station. The bill, whose lead sponsor is Senator Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, would authorise the ISS operations to be extended from 2024 to 2030, while directing NASA to assist increased commercial activities in low Earth orbit. The bill also supports the ISS by extending a waiver to sanctions under the Iran, North Korea and Syria Non-Proliferation Act, so the agency can continue to work with Russia until the end of 2030. The bill directs NASA to have the Block 1B version of the Space Launch System ready by the third flight of the rocket, a faster timetable than NASA's current plans. The bill authorises several programs and missions, from NASA's Education Office to WFIRST astronomy mission that NASA has sought to cancel. The Senate Commerce Committee is expected to mark up the bill this week. Further, the White House warned Senate appropriators last month that funding levels in a spending bill then under consideration would keep NASA from returning humans to the moon by 2024. A letter from the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget said the $1.6 billion allocated for exploration, research and development programs, including lunar landers and the Lunar Gateway, was far short of the $2.3 billion requested by NASA. The letter said full funding of the program is required to support the administration's goal of returning to the moon by 2024. The letter also sought relief from language requiring Europa Clipper launch on the Space Launch System, saying NASA needed all the available SLS rockets for exploration programs, and the agency could save as much as $1.5 billion by launching the mission on a commercial vehicle. Interesting. Okay, over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Angelo, and good evening, space fans. In International Space Station news, as reported here on Space News last week, a NASA astronaut is preparing to be the only American on the ISS for as long as 6 months next year. Chris Cassidy will fly to the station in April on a Soyuz rocket with Russian cosmonauts Nikolai Tikhonov and Andrei Babin. The 3 may be the only people on the station from shortly after their arrival to the end of their mission next October, depending on the status of commercial crew vehicles slated to make crewed test flights to the ISS sometime next year. Cassidy told a news conference he and his Russian crewmates were ready to have the station to themselves for as long as 6 months, acknowledging that the reduced crew will leave less time for them to carry out research. Turning to NASA's Commercial Crew Program, Boeing and NASA declared a pad abort test of the company's CST-100 Starliner a success, despite a parachute problem. The Starliner lifted off a pad at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico last week, using its abort engines and other thrusters to accelerate to more than 1,000 kilometres per hour in a matter of seconds, to demonstrate the ability of the spacecraft to escape a malfunctioning rocket. The Starliner reached a peak altitude of about 1,350 metres before landing a minute and a half after liftoff, but only 2 of its 3 main parachutes properly deployed during the capsule's descent. Boeing said the capsule was designed to land safely without all 3 parachutes, describing the incident as a deployment anomaly, not a parachute failure. Boeing doesn't expect the parachute issue to delay an uncrewed orbital flight test scheduled for December 17 from Cape Canaveral. Later on, Boeing stated that a misplaced pin prevented one of the 3 parachutes from deploying during the pad abort test. A Boeing spokesperson said a pin connecting a pilot parachute with one of the 3 main parachutes was not properly installed, preventing the pilot chute from deploying the main one. Technicians have already worked to confirm that similar pins are properly installed on the parachutes in the Starliner scheduled for next month's uncrewed test flight. Boeing said an initial review of the data from the test confirmed that all other aspects of the flight went as planned. Meanwhile, United Launch Alliance has started stacking the Atlas V booster that will launch the Boeing Commercial Crew test flight. The Atlas V, being assembled at Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral, will launch Boeing's CST-100 Starliner on an uncrewed test flight scheduled for December 17. The launch will be the first Atlas V to fly without a payload fairing and the first to use a dual-engine Centaur upper stage. And in yet more parachute news, SpaceX has conducted 13 consecutive successful tests of its new Commercial Crew parachute system. The company released video recently of the latest test, the first to involve 3 of the new Mark III parachutes. The previous 12 tests involved a single parachute, while the complete system that will be used on Crew Dragon spacecraft features 4 parachutes. The company acknowledged that the first 2 tests of Mark III parachutes failed, but said it worked with parachute company Airborne Systems to revise the design that has since been successful. SpaceX hopes to have the parachutes, one of the key technologies required for the spacecraft, certified by the end of the year.
And turning to NASA, SLS and Orion news. NASA turned down a proposal by Blue Origin to develop an alternative upper stage for the SLS. In a procurement filing recently, NASA said that Blue Origin offered, in response to a request for information, an upper stage that would use its BE-3U engines rather than the RL-10 engines for the exploration upper stage. NASA said the Blue Origin alternative would make the SLS too tall to fit into the vehicle assembly building without modifications to the structure, and also have design impacts on the Orion spacecraft. NASA, in that filing, concluded that it would proceed with the exploration upper stage despite concerns outside the agency about its costs. Turning to NASA's moon program, Boeing announced last week that it is proposing a lunar lander for NASA that could be launched on the Space Launch System. The company's fewest steps to the moon involves launching an integrated lander on an SLS Block 1B, which could go from lunar orbit to the surface and back without the need for an additional transfer stage or tug. The company says its approach minimises the number of critical events like launches and dockings compared to alternatives where lunar lander modules are launched individually and aggregated at the Lunar Gateway. Last week was the deadline for companies to submit human lunar lander proposals to NASA. And turning to NASA's planetary and space science missions. NASA's Voyager 2 spacecraft is now in interstellar space. In a series of papers published last week, scientists analysing data from the mission concluded that the spacecraft left the heliosphere, the region where plasma from the Sun dominates, last year. Voyager 1 left the heliosphere in 2012, and differences in the data between the two spacecraft at the time each spacecraft entered interstellar space could be explained by the different trajectories of the two spacecraft, as well as the fact the departures took place at different times in the Sun's 11-year cycle of activity. Both spacecraft, launched in 1977, should continue to operate for 5 more years before they exhaust their power supplies. Moving to Europe, also experiencing parachute problems. Top officials with the European Space Agency remain confident that parachute problems with the ExoMars 2020 mission can be corrected in time for its launch next northern summer. Ground tests of the parachutes are underway at JPL facilities, with high-altitude balloon tests scheduled for early next year. The focus of the work is on the parachute extraction system, which appears to be the cause of tearing in the parachutes in 2 tests earlier this year. Officials said they believe the problem can be fixed in time for a launch in late July or early August, in part because the parachutes can be integrated into the Mars lander late in the pre-launch processing. And it's over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Michael. We're swinging over to China now. China now plans to launch its Chang'e 5 lunar sample return mission late next year. The mission will attempt to collect and return around 2 kilograms of lunar samples from a site close to Mons Rumke, a volcanic formation situated in the Oceanus Procellarum region of the western edge of the near side of the Moon. Its launch has been delayed by problems with the Long March 5 rocket, which failed in a July 2017 launch, and whose return to flight has now expected to take place in the second half of December. Chang'e 5 will fly after the Long March 5 launch of China's first Mars mission in mid-2020. Meanwhile, China's Chang'e 4 lunar lander mission has completed its 11th lunar day. The lander's Yutu-2 rover is now 218 metres from the lander, having driven more than 318 metres across the surface since the spacecraft landed in early January. Chinese officials said instruments on both the lander and the rover were working well, but provided few other details about the science they have returned. And back to you, Angelo.
Okay, SpaceX. SpaceX tested a Falcon 9 last week that will launch the next batch of Starlink satellites. The static fire test of the Falcon 9's first stage engines confirmed that the rocket was ready to launch from Cape Canaveral, carrying the second set of satellites for the company's broadband satellite constellation. The launch is the 4th flight of that particular Falcon 9 first stage and will reuse a payload fairing recovered from a Falcon Heavy launch in April. The launch is first for SpaceX in more than 3 months. Elon Musk used a surprise appearance at an Air Force event last week to emphasise the importance of reusable rockets. Musk, appearing at the Air Force's Space Pitch Day in San Francisco, said a fully reusable rocket like the Starship Super Heavy system SpaceX is developing is the holy grail of the space industry. Once that vehicle is operational, Musk estimated it would cost the company about $2 million. Yep, you heard it right. $2 million for a single launch that could place 100 to 150 tons into low Earth orbit. Just to put this into context, the SLS launch was estimated to cost one launch $2 billion, and you'll need 2 of them to get to the moon, which is $4 billion. Plus, if you're going to have the exploration upper stage develop, which Michael just spoke about before, it will cost possibly $4.6 billion. So the orders of magnitude are staggering. All right, Peter.
And finally this week, scientists opened a lunar sample last week that had been sealed since the Apollo program. The sample tube containing lunar rocks and regolith was collected during the Apollo 17 mission in 1972, but never opened until now. As reported here on Space News, NASA announced plans earlier this year to give scientists access to the sealed samples so modern instrumentation could be used to gain new insights about the moon in preparation for future human missions. Well, there you go. Well, thank you, everybody, and that's it for Space News this week. We'll talk to you again next week. Thank you, everyone. Bye.